I'm Walter Isaacson of the Aspen Institute, and I'm here with Lynne Cheney, author of James Madison, A Life Reconsidered. So he becomes president in 1808, succeeding his friend Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson helps him become president, right?
Well, Jefferson helped in many ways, not least of which was by nominating very old vice presidents, or being sure that he had very old vice presidents on the ticket, so that Madison was the young up-and-comer.
And so Madison, as president, keeps the legacy of Jefferson going. We have three Virginians in a row, which is Jefferson, Madison, and then Monroe. Explain the relationship to Monroe, because Monroe and Madison were supposed to be friends, but Monroe then kind of challenged Madison a few times, but then they reconcile when Madison becomes president. Is that about right?
Madison and Monroe had such an interesting relationship. I think that Monroe was maybe a little too full of self-regard, and he always saw himself as able to do more than he could politically. He was great in military service. So he challenged Madison for the House of Representatives in the first Congress, and then he challenged Madison in his bid to be president. Did not sit well with Dolly. James never said anything about it, but Dolly was not happy.
I know they don't visit Monroe's house when they used to do it all the time. But he then eventually makes Monroe the Secretary of State, right?
Yes. You know, I think I write in that chapter that a good cabinet member is hard to find. And it was even more so in the early years of the Republic. There just simply wasn't a cadre of people who were, working in that direction from whom you could choose. And that made Monroe stand out all the more. And he turned out to be a good Secretary of State for Madison. And he also served as Secretary of War and did a good job.
Now, the two parties have now begun to solidify by this point, the Federalists and the Republicans. Does somebody like Madison have some Federalists in his administration, or have we gotten to the point where a president only appoints people of his party?
Well, by now, the Federalists are nearly dead, moribund. There aren't many of them. And I really can't think of anyone who Madison reached out to, because he didn't need to. The Federalists didn't represent a great political force.
So one of the things Monroe works with Madison on is trying to diffuse tensions with both France and England. Why are we having disputes with both those countries?
Well, both of them are disrespecting us on the high seas, seizing ships, taking cargoes. The British are especially inventive at finding ways to increase their naval manpower by taking our sailors off our ships. So we're having disputes with both, but it is more serious with Great Britain. And Madison believed that not only because he thought the depredations were worse, but he thought that Britain represented our colonial past, and that were we to yield to Great Britain, we would be backtracking on the revolution.
But there is a bit of a split in the country because the New England states are still a little bit more loyal to Britain, perhaps because of their trading and because of their, heritage.
Exactly. There is a split, and there is talk, whispers even, of secession during the War of 1812.
So the War of 1812 with Britain comes about mainly because of trade and tariffs and impressment of sailors on the seas. It's basically a trading dispute at first.
Well, perhaps, but it's also the case that the Republicans, the Madison administration, suspected that the British were fomenting Indian warfare on the frontier, and that they were allied with the Indians who were creating havoc for American settlers. As the Indians saw it, of course, these people were coming into their territory.
So how does the War of 1812 begin?
With a declaration of war on the part of the Congress. Madison was very careful to encourage them to do this, to tell them to put the country into an attitude ready for war. But he made sure, he was very careful, that it was a declaration on the part of Congress. The forces involved were the Westerners, who didn't like what the British were doing in their alliance with Indians. Many of the people who voted for the war had lost loved ones in Indian conflicts.
And the Speaker of the House then is a young sort of Westerner, Henry Clay, who helps push Madison and the country into understanding why there should be a war. Is that right?
Exactly. Some people have called it Mr. Clay's War.
Did he feel that he had to sort of stiffen Madison's backbone a bit?
Well, he might have felt that way. It's all about perspectives, but I don't think Madison's backbone needed much stiffening by this point. He had been working for years to prevent this war, and I think finally regarded it as inevitable.
And he felt that he should go to the Congress of the United States to declare war for political reasons or constitutional reasons?
Constitutional reasons. But politics, of course, played in. If the Congress votes a declaration of war, then it's not all on the executive's shoulders.
And it was not a very easy war. We don't have a very good Secretary of War at that period. We start losing on the Indian front. So tell me about the war and the conduct of it.
Well, it was a disaster on land, especially at the beginning. Not at the end, though, but at the beginning it was a disaster on land. We had decided to invade Canada in order to kind of have a hostage, I think, that would make the British think twice about what they were doing at sea and what they were doing to support Indian attacks on the frontier. But the invasions of Canada were just a disaster. In one case, General Hull was so worried about Indian attacks that he totally surrendered before any shots had been fired and gave up part of Detroit.
Yeah, we didn't have very good generals, I read in your book.
No, that's true, and it's because they were left over from the Revolution.
They were old too, right?
Exactly. They were long in the tooth. The fate of the nation at sea was much different because, when you've got a ship, you can't retire the crew and just sort of let it sit there and then bring them back when you need them. They keep practicing. And so we were well practiced at sea, and we accomplished some remarkable victories that buoyed the nation when the land campaign was going so badly.
It also gave us our national anthem.
It did. During the invasion of Washington, we had suffered a moment of great national embarrassment that the British would come and burn our public buildings. But as they headed back toward the Chesapeake, where the fleet awaited, they organized an attack on Baltimore. And it was a remarkable success for the Americans. The British attack failed. We killed the British commander. And Francis Scott Key, who by chance was watching this whole event from a ship in the harbor, wrote the national anthem.
And the War of 1812 finally ends with a treaty that's actually signed before the Battle of New Orleans, but we like to think that battle was still important.
Well, it was important because we had, toward the end of the war, been having more success on land. Even though the British were now sending large numbers of troops over here, our generals were now in a new generation and proving more successful. That sort of capped the idea that the United States could be a power on land as well as on the water. And so I think it was part of the war, whether it came after the Treaty of Ghent or not.
And speaking of the whole war, though, was the war useless? We just got back to where we started? Or was the war a really important war to have fought?
No, the people at the time called it the Second War of Independence. And I understand why they came to regard it that way, because now it was clear to everyone that the revolution wasn't just a one-off event that could be superseded by the British control in the United States once more.
It showed him as a wartime president, and I think you have a wonderful phrase about it in your book, that he had a genial manner but an audacity at being decisive. Explain that trait of Madison.
Audacity in a very restrained way. When he made a decision, such as going to war, for example, he made sure that it was the Congress who declared it. So it was audacious. We'd never done anything like that before. His was an interesting political personality, not the kind of braggadocio and backslapping that we all too often come to expect from politicians. A restrained and intelligent manner that served him very well.
So was he a good president?
Oh, I think. And one of the reasons that I wrote this book is because I don't think his contribution has been recognized. I saw somewhere the other day that it was a ranking of presidents, a good one, the people involved, but he was somewhere behind Zachary Taylor and Grover Cleveland, which is just bizarre. I would rank him not above Washington, of course, but equal with Jefferson, or perhaps even a little above.
And is that why you call it a Life Reconsidered?
That's part of it. I think that he just has not generally, not just in his presidential actions, but just not generally in all his contributions, been given the credit he deserves.
In some ways, he's the intellectual foundation of our nation.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.